Today we're going to do one of my favorite presentations. This one is about diabetes. Hello, my name is Sean Egglestone. I'm a registered dietitian in the state of Oregon. We're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about what diabetes is, what actually causes diabetes, and what we can do about it. To start off with some basic facts, what we find is that about 10% of Americans actually have diabetes, and over 1 million children and adults have what's called type 1 diabetes. And on the next slide, we'll go over the difference between the two types of diabetes. It's estimated that in the next 25 years, as many as 30% of Americans will have diabetes. 50% of diabetics are on insulin therapy after 10 years. So oftentimes when people first get diagnosed with diabetes, sometimes they get put on oral hypoglycemic agents, in other words, pills that help lower their blood sugar, but sometimes they're started on insulin. So insulin compounds the issue because we know that when people start taking insulin, they often gain weight. It causes inflammation in our body as well, and we know that high exposure to insulin can increase our risk for certain conditions. Now, one point that I try and stress with my patients that have diabetes, especially the new diabetic patients, is that diabetes itself does not kill you. What kills you is the heart disease, because the number one cause of death for people with diabetes is heart disease. And so there's also a lot of complications with diabetes as well that makes it such a dangerous disease. Many people will think of it as, oh, I just need to control my blood sugar. But what we find is that diabetes is the number one cause for things like kidney failure, blindness in working-aged Americans, so those under 65, and limb amputations outside of wartime. Unfortunately, it's also found by the CDC report that came out in 2017 that over 100 million Americans have what we call pre-diabetes. But that means that there's a fair amount of people that are at a very high risk for developing diabetes, and they don't even know. 9 out of 10 don't even know they have pre-diabetes. That's a huge issue. Those with pre-diabetes, a fair amount of them will get diabetes in the next 5 years. Now, gestational diabetes is when pregnant women develop diabetes, and the problem with that is it increases their risk for getting diabetes after they have the child. So some key definitions before we get started here. So we talked about insulin in the previous slide. That's a hormone that the beta cells in the pancreas produce that allows your body to absorb glucose. Type 1 diabetes is what we call insulin-dependent diabetes, and that's an autoimmune disorder that is typically diagnosed in children or at a very, very young age. And the treatment for people with type 1 diabetes is they absolutely need to take insulin. Oftentimes these people do well with what we call insulin pumps, and they also need to have a good, healthy diet and exercise to complement that. Now, type 2 diabetes is different because type 2 diabetes is not an autoimmune attack on your pancreas, but it is characterized by impaired insulin sensitivity and also insulin production by the beta cells in the pancreas. The treatment is oftentimes they start off on oral hypoglycemic agents, sometimes they progress to insulin, and of course diet and exercise are two factors that help reduce our risk or help treat type 2 diabetes. Now, a very important term that you should know, especially if you have diabetes, is your hemoglobin A1C. Your hemoglobin A1C is a 3-month average of your blood sugars. So if you look at the top right of this slide, you'll see that a normal hemoglobin A1C is 4.5 to 5.6. Now there's a little mistake here in the slide. So if your hemoglobin A1C is 5.7 to 6.4, that's considered pre-diabetes, and then 6.5 or higher is considered diabetes. Now, there's something called diet-controlled diabetes, which just means that you have an elevated hemoglobin A1C, whether you're pre-diabetic or it is, in the sixes, but you're not taking any medication and you're quote unquote, controlling your blood sugars with diet. And of course, gestational diabetes is diabetes that's diagnosed during pregnancy. So let's go over what happens when we eat. So when we eat foods, especially foods that contain carbohydrates, they break down in our intestines, and the sugars from the food go into our bloodstream. Now, I don't want you to think of sugar or glucose in the bloodstream as a bad thing, because just like fuel in a car, glucose is absolutely essential for doing your activities during the day, for exercise, for energy, right? And when people are sluggish, they say their sugars are low. So we really, glucose is very important for proper health and function, but we do want to note that foods with carbohydrates break down into sugar and they enter our bloodstream. And it's important to note that a fair amount, at least 80% of that glucose, goes to the muscles for use. Now, in order for glucose to enter the cells in our body, we need a hormone called insulin. Insulin is like a key that opens the cell and allows glucose to go in. So without insulin, like in type 1 diabetics, without insulin, their blood sugars get real high, but they have very low energy because that sugar is not entering the cell. So they have to take insulin that allows the sugar to get into the cells. So why do we get diabetes? And this is a very, very important slide, because what we find is that people say, oh, you get diabetes because you have high blood sugars. But the thing is, having high blood sugars or hyperglycemia is a symptom of diabetes, not the cause of diabetes. And so bringing our blood sugars down with diet and medication, while it's important, the high blood sugar is just a symptom of an underlying problem, not the problem itself. And so without addressing the underlying issue, you're not improving your health substantially. So with type 1 diabetes, why might people get type 1 diabetes? Now, generally speaking, the scientific community has not come to a general consensus on this issue, but there are some very interesting studies that link early exposure to dairy to increase our risk for type 1 diabetes. Another reason why we might get diabetes is that poor diet, eating unhealthy foods, reduces the insulin production in the pancreas, and it decreases insulin sensitivity in our tissues. So on the next slide, we'll go over exactly what that looks like inside the body. But those are the two causes of diabetes. It's a decrease in insulin production and a decrease in insulin sensitivity. Now, family history and genetics play a small role in why people get diabetes, but it's not a major player, not a major player. What we do find, though, is that obesity tends to run in families, and families tend to have similar eating habits. So what you ate is what your parents ate, is what your grandparents ate. So when people say, oh, diabetes runs in my family, it's like, no, diabetes is a symptom of the cause or the problem, which is your diet, and diets run in families. Now, there are some genes that have been linked with increased risk for diabetes, but what we find is that genetic disorders don't increase exponentially over time. And so when you see people that either move to different countries and adopt different diets, or you see, like in the bottom right here, this graph, this huge increase in the prevalence of diabetes, it can't be genetic, because genetic does not increase exponentially like that over time. Lack of exercise and stressful lifestyle. So we know that exercise increases our insulin sensitivity, and stress increases insulin production. So those two things compound the problem. Now, certain surgeries, such as Whipple's or where they remove the pancreas, those will obviously induce type 1 diabetes, because now we don't have the beta cells in the pancreas to produce insulin. Now, there's some other risk factors that people say, such as race, age, and gestational diabetes, hypertension, high lipid panel, polycystic ovarian syndrome. But what I'd like to point out is all of these things have a relationship with diet, right? And so obviously the older you get, risk might go up because you've been eating poorly for a very, very long time. And, having gestational diabetes, again, is a symptom of eating poorly. And so, really, gestational diabetes by itself, I feel, doesn't necessarily increase your risk for diabetes. It's just a marker that shows that what you're eating is just not the right stuff. So if we take a look at the twin cycle hypothesis, we see that a positive caloric balance over time causes fat buildup in the liver. Now, not only does fat build up in the liver and decrease the liver's response to insulin and blood sugar, but fat also increases in proportion in the pancreas. And so when we have fat in the pancreas, it's actually toxic to the beta cells. And so the beta cells either die off or they hibernate in a way that they can be woken up, but they hibernate. And so what that means is the pancreas stops producing enough insulin, which causes our blood sugars to rise. And high blood sugars over time also increase the fat deposits in our liver. And so what we're finding here is that a positive caloric balance over time causes fat to build up in our organs, which decreases not only the insulin production, but how we respond to insulin and sugar in the blood. It is important to note that fat will also build up in the muscles. So what we see here is decreased insulin sensitivity. So now we've talked about decreased insulin production in the pancreas, but what about insulin in our blood? So if our pancreas is still producing some insulin, or if you're on insulin therapy, that insulin is going to have a blunted effect in our muscles because we have the deposit of what we call intramyocellular lipids, or fat inside the muscle cells. Now that interferes with how the signaling between insulin and the muscle cells. That means that you need a higher level of insulin in the blood in order for the cells to uptake glucose. One of the ways that we know this is because of bariatric surgery. What we find is that bariatric patients that have diabetes, that 84% of them experience complete reversal of their type 2 diabetes after surgery. We see a rapid improvement in blood sugars and the reduction or elimination of diabetic medications. So these results are typically persistent for the rest of life as long as a normal body weight is sustained. So what this means is that when our bariatric patients see a complete reversal of type 2 diabetes, which happens very rapidly, it's because of the fat buildup in the liver and the fat buildup in the pancreas, as well as the muscles, leaves those organs, those tissues, very quickly after surgery. And so what we find is that it's not so much the fat around your waist that increases your risk for diabetes. It's the fat inside your organs and your tissues. And so after surgery, that fat leaves those tissues very rapidly, and that's why we see such a quick decrease in the presence of diabetes. So just to recap, it's not about how much intra-abdominal fat you have, but how much fat is inside your muscles, your pancreas, and your liver. Although what we do find is that 2/3 of people with diabetes are overweight, because if you're overweight or obese, that may predict or increase your chances for the deposit of fat in your organs. But that also explains why some diabetics are actually skinny. And we're talking about type 2 diabetics here that are compliant. And that is because if you are genetically predispositioned to have an elevated fat inside of your organs, you may get diabetes before you become obese. So can diabetes be cured? We're going to look at a few sources here. So the Mayo Clinic says there's no cure for type 2 diabetes, but you may be able to manage the condition. The Joslin Diabetes Center says there's no cure for diabetes. Neither type 1 nor type diabetes ever goes away. Another thing that I've heard is that you always have diabetes even if your hemoglobin A1C is normal. And I find that to be absolutely preposterous. That's like saying that you are still fat even if you lose the weight. What they mean is that if you had diabetes and it goes away, you are more likely to become diabetic again. But if your hemoglobin A1C is within the normal range, under 5.7%, I would say you do not have diabetes anymore, as long as you're not on medications to lower that number. And diabetes.org, type 2 diabetes remission can occur in people who have not had weight loss surgery, but it's very, very rare. But we just showed you in the previous slide that 84% of people with Roux-en-Y gastric bypass surgery, their diabetes goes away. And it's not very rare. There's a lot of people that get gastric bypass. Unfortunately, when we dig a little deeper, you find that a lot of these places, especially the Joslin Diabetes Center, they're getting funding from the pharmaceutical industry that produces insulin. Places like AstraZeneca, Lilly, and Novo Nordisk. These companies put a lot of money, a lot of lobbying, and have a lot of power over what's being said about diabetes. And so if they keep the public misinformed and say, oh, there's no cure, then everyone is just going to keep on doing what they're doing, and they're going to keep using the insulin and not try and make the changes in their life that they should. So how can we prevent diabetes or improve our diabetes if we have it? This is a really nice quote that I like in the top right. If people did just 4 simple things: not smoking, exercising a half-hour a day, eating a diet that emphasizes whole plant foods, and not becoming obese, they may prevent most cases of diabetes, heart attack, half of stroke, and a third of cancer. So when we're talking about preventing or improving diabetes, nutrition is key. Nutrition is the #1 thing you can do. It's arguably the largest cause of diabetes. And the Harvard School of Public Health determines that 90% of diabetes can be prevented in the first place. The thing about nutrition is it's something we do often. We do it 3 times a day. You're already shopping, you're already preparing food, and you're already eating. So let's go ahead and make those choices better. And it's also easy to control. You have full control over what you eat. Movement is also important because we know that with movement, your muscles become more insulin sensitive. And we know that it's very important to be insulin sensitive. That way you need less insulin to get those blood sugars into the muscles. So exercise is more than just the gym. Think walking, biking, gardening, swimming, dancing, biking. There's a lot of different activities. Now, the Department of Human and Health Services says 150 minutes of moderate aerobic activity a week. Other places, like nutritionfacts.org, Dr. Greger says 90 minutes a day. I think this 150 minutes a week is simply not enough. It's only 20 minutes a day. And a lot of this advice that you see put out for the general public is sort of dumbed down, if you will, because they just don't think that the general public would comply if they actually provided the real advice that would help people get healthy. So I would say closer to an hour and a half a day of exercise will put you in a much better place for preventing diabetes than 150 minutes a week. Stress reduction is also important. So through meditation, music, walking, spending time in the woods, these things will also help lower your blood sugars. And don't smoke and abstain from alcohol, of course. So what the heck am I supposed to eat? So now we've learned about why we get diabetes, right? It's the buildup of fat inside of our organs and our tissues, which then impairs our production of insulin, and it decreases our insulin sensitivity. But what am I supposed to eat? There's so many diets out there, and it just isn't clear. But what we find is that all credible diets or cookbooks will generally have a few things in common. And one of the things that you can tell if a diet is good is it focuses on whole foods, just as nature intended us to eat them. So nothing that comes from a box, a can, a bag, or a bottle, stuff that has nutrient labels and facts and additional ingredients. You want to stay away from that stuff as much as possible and buy the simple foods individually and learn to cook at home and produce those meals yourself. So a lot of produce, fruits, vegetables, going to the bulk bin section and getting your whole grains, your nuts and your seeds, your pasta, your beans, okay? If you want to have some meat, Get the whole stuff. Don't get the deli meat that increases your risk for colon cancer. Don't get the frozen, breaded, fried patties and that kind of stuff. You want whole food, single ingredients. You also want to look at the ratio of the produce to meat. So if you have a diet that emphasizes meat and downplays the intake of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, or nuts and seeds, I would avoid that altogether. Especially diets that try and avoid fruit, which are extremely high in vitamins and minerals, or they try and have you stay away from grains or beans. Grains and beans are the highest sources of fiber, so if you stay away from those things, you might get constipated. And we know that fiber is very important for good gut bacteria. So good diets will also have you follow recipes and do your own cooking. Okay, you have to do your own cooking. That's why, unfortunately, that a lot of people get benefits, lose weight when they follow, terrible, terrible diets like the keto diet, because they're starting to cook on their own, and they're staying away from things that no one is actually recommending, like donuts and pastries and cupcakes and white flour and white sugar. And so when you stay away from these things, you're going to get better results, no matter what the diet is titled. But more than anything, there's no secret pill, there's no superfoods, there's no powders, there's no temporary fix. This is about long-term lifestyle change. When I go grocery shopping, I pick whole foods, minimal ingredients, minimal processing. I look for, no added salt, or if it says low sodium, that means that it's under 100, it's 140 or less milligrams per serving. So low sodium, not reduced salt, low sodium is what I look for. We're moving away from solid fats like butters and moving towards oils, but we just want to use 2 tablespoons or less per day. But we really want our fat in our diet to come from things like nuts and seeds, avocados, and beans. These are great sources of fat. We want to buy mostly produce and check out the bulk section. When we're cooking and eating, what I make sure is half the food I have in the fridge at home, half the food in my shopping cart, and half the food on my plate is produce, fruits, and vegetables. We want to drink mostly water and avoid things like sodas and juices, even diet sodas. We want to saute with just maybe a little bit of vegetable broth, low sodium vegetable broth, or a little bit of water. Sometimes I'll use maybe half a tablespoon of oil, but that's it. Very, very low. We want to use whole grains in place of white flour, white bread, white tortillas, and white rice. We want to use spices and herbs instead of salt. So throw away the garlic salt and get yourself some garlic powder. And when baking, because I love to bake, I often cut the oils in half and I reduce the salt sometimes altogether. And I experiment with different baked goods, but with less salt, less fat. If you really want to get into this a little bit in more detail, you can check out the Dietary Guidelines for Americans 2015 to 2020. We need more vegetables, more fruits, more whole grains, okay? You can forget about the meat and the dairy and stuff. What this is showing is 6 to 7 ounces of meat per day. So most Americans are eating way too much meat. And we know the Harvard School of Public Health says you really shouldn't have more than 1 to 2 servings of dairy a day. And we know that dairy really is not that good for us. So we want to stay away from those things. But really, I want you to focus on, we're talking about 21 to 28 cups of fruits and vegetables per week. That's a lot of fruits, a lot of vegetables. We need to dramatically increase our produce intake. This is just another slide that shows sort of a breakdown here. And this is a little slide that I came up with. This is the Ultimate RG handout. So here we have half our plate, fruits and vegetables. Just don't fry them. Don't have added salt or syrups, okay? And we really need 9 servings per day of fruits and vegetables. We talked about whole grains. We want to eat either whole grains or what we call intact grains. So quinoa, oatmeal, barley, millet. So these foods are intact. So when certain people recommend that you stay away from sugar or you stay away from carbs, what they're talking about is stay away from the refined flours and the added sugars. But having stuff like corn and oatmeal and sweet potatoes are not the problem. We want to drink mostly water, and we want to focus on plant proteins, beans, lentils, tofu, that sort of stuff. And certainly, at all costs, avoid bacon, cold cuts, and processed meats. Real quick here, I just want to show you. So here we have Piggly Wiggly ground beef. It says 90% extra lean, so you're looking at this saying, wow, this is 10% fat. This is a pretty low fat product. But what you find is that when you look at the calories and you look at the fat calories, this product is actually 50% fat. So how come they're telling us it's 90% lean if this is 50% of the calories from fat? And that's because they calculate the fat by weight. So you'll notice that a serving size is 113 grams, whereas the total fat is 11 grams. And so they just divide 11 into 113 and they get about 90% lean. But when you cook meat, that water comes off, reducing the weight. And what we find is that a lot of those calories are actually fat. So not so low fat after all. Same thing about this reduced fat here from the ranch. Okay, people are like, oh, reduced fat ranch must be good. You're still looking at over 90% of the calories coming from fat. When we're looking at sodium here, again, reduced sodium you want to stay away from, or less sodium, because that just means less than the original, and it doesn't mean it's low in sodium. So where do we go from here? How can we make things better? How can we improve our health as a nation and reduce the presence of diabetes? Well, first and foremost, we need to start screening for diabetes very early, very, very early, checking our hemoglobin A1C routinely. Another thing we should look at is things like the glucose tolerance test or the hyperglycemic clamp technique. These are two techniques that are very specific, and they look at your body's response to insulin and blood sugar. And these are very good predictors for things like diabetes. We need to decrease the number of cases that progress to full-blown diabetes. So if you have prediabetes, start taking this very seriously and take aggressive action immediately. We want to reduce the cases that progress to full-blown diabetes, and we want to progress the cases that now require insulin. We want to take hypertension, high blood cholesterol, and obesity way more seriously. These are things that I call the trifecta. If you're overweight, if you have high blood sugars, or I should say if you have a hypertension and you have a high lipid panel, these things will almost always predict a future heart attack. And if you have diabetes on top of that, you're in real serious trouble. So instead of just taking pills for these things and saying, oh, I'm okay, the pills got me, we want to take them very seriously. If you've got hypertension, that means something is wrong with your diet. We need to change it right away, immediately, aggressively take action. So healthy nutrition won't happen overnight, but it needs to happen for the rest of your life. This is a lifestyle change, not a quick fix, okay? First and foremost, we need to create a lifestyle and a culture surrounding health and nutrition. Make it popular for hospitals to serve healthy foods. We need to have grocery stores getting the garbage off the shelves. We need to have potlucks, restaurants, blogs, websites. All these things need to be promoting healthy diets. Create a culture surrounding us. That way we're more likely to make the right choices. We also need to take an active role in our health. The more you invest and the more you do now, the better you're going to do in the long term. Okay? Breastfeed. Please, women, breastfeed your babies. We know that breastfeeding decreases your risk for diabetes and possibly decreases the risk for the baby to develop diabetes. Very, very important to breastfeed. Have options. If you don't have options in the house, you're going to make the wrong choices. So keep good, healthy options around. You're more likely to choose the right foods. Move your body in a way that you enjoy and that you can do every single day. So if you're not the kind of type that wants to go to the gym, but there's other activities like dancing or tennis that you enjoy, move your body in a meaningful way that you really, really enjoy and that you can do. Okay? Doesn't have to be going to the gym. We need to have authoritative sources that provide well-rounded and conflict of interest-free, comprehensive information. We need to get the full picture, okay? There's a lot of cases, especially documented clinical cases, of people reversing diabetes. So let's not tell people it's never going to happen. I think we need to be honest with the public. If you have diabetes, it may be able to go away, but it may not, right? Because we know that diabetes takes decades to develop. So you might be in a spot where your pancreas is so damaged that that's just not happening. You're not reversing your diabetes. But if we can catch it early enough and have really good aggressive action, we may be able to get off our diabetic medications. And if it's not possible for you, it'll still greatly impact your health in a positive way. So let's promote that, and let's provide conflict of free interests. Let's get the pharmaceutical interests out of the food and the health recommendations and start eating healthy. Go see a registered dietitian, not a nutritionist. The registered dietitian will have training, specialized advice, and a reputation to uphold. Losing 5 to 10% of your current weight can significantly improve your blood glucose and your insulin levels, because losing just a little bit can help get that fat out of those organs. And then some of these other tips, again, we've already talked about that. When we eat dessert, enjoy it. Healthy nutrition doesn't have to suck, but just don't go overboard with the desserts, okay? We drink our smoothies every day like we find on this channel. Have patience and compassion for yourself. Change takes time. You will fall off the bandwagon, but don't give up. Get back on and keep trying, and create a culture of health around yourself and people that love and support you in your efforts, and you will find that making lasting change in your life is easy to do and very rewarding. So I hope you found this presentation helpful. If you have any questions, please post and leave them down below. Cheers.